At 7:03 a.m. in the frozen woods of western Germany, an American corporal realized his worst fear. His rifle was dead. No trigger, no bolt, nothing. And 10 German soldiers were closing in, spreading through the trees like hunters who knew their target was helpless. He could hear their voices, their boots, their confidence. He had no backup, no squad, no time to think. In that moment, with death walking straight toward him, he made a decision so insane, so unexpected, that it would rewrite everything the army believed about survival and broken weapons. Over the next 48 hours, that jammed, frozen rifle would take the lives of every soldier hunting him and force the U.S. Army to rethink everything it believed about weapon reliability in winter combat. But at that moment, Sullivan couldn't fire a single shot. All he could do was clutch a dead piece of steel while the men around him were cut down one by one. The M1 Garand, America's pride, the rifle patent praised as the finest battlefield tool ever built, had become nothing more than a cold, silent weight in his hands. 8 pounds of walnut and steel, semi-automatic, 30-06, and deadly accurate out to 500 yards. It was American engineering forged into something a soldier could carry. Every GI who landed in Europe trusted it completely, believing U.S. firepower gave them the edge. But the Garand carried a fatal flaw. It despised moisture, especially when mixed with freezing temperatures and the thick carbon-soaked oils issued in 1944. Sullivan learned this lesson the brutal way. Born in 1922 in the harsh hills of Butte, Montana, he grew up watching his father descend 3,000 feet into the copper mines every day. The Sullivans lived in a cramped company house on Mercury Street. 3 rooms for 6 people, walls so thin every whispered word carried. Each evening, Red's father returned from the mines coated in rock dust, hacking a cough that would, by age 45, turn wet and bloody. Red watched him waste away from silicosis, a slow death that haunted his teenage years. He promised himself he would never descend into the mines. Instead, he became a mechanic. Harsh winters and high-altitude cold made engines as unforgiving as the mines themselves. And in drafty garages, Red learned exactly how metal contracted, thickened, and seized below zero. He learned which oils thickened in the cold, which metal parts contracted, and how tolerances vanished when temperatures plummeted to -20. Summer lubricants became winter killers. The Army didn't care. When Sullivan enlisted in December 1942, they handed him an M1 Garand and a maintenance manual written by engineers who had never faced a battlefield winter. The instructions called for a light preservative oil, Army designation LP, promising it worked in all conditions. Apply liberally, the manual said. And like every soldier before him, Red read it and applied it exactly as ordered. Every other rifleman in the 28th Infantry Division followed the same routine. By November 1944, as they pushed into the Hurtgen forest, men were already dying because of it. 70 square miles of dense pine, steep ravines and logging roads turned to treacherous mud. Rain fell without pause. When it stopped, sleet whipped down. When that ended, snow blanketed the ground. Temperatures hovered between 28 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze water, yet warm enough to keep it flowing, turning the forest into a relentless, slippery trap for every soldier who entered. The trees were so dense that artillery shells exploding in the canopy sent splinters raining down like deadly shrapnel. The Germans had spent months fortifying every trail, clearing, and approach. The 28th Division stepped into the forest on November 2nd. By the 6th, they had already lost 31% of their men. By the 12th, casualties rose to 45%. 14,000 men entered, 6,000 would emerge. Many fell because their rifles refused to fire. Private Eddie Harmon was part of Sullivan's squad. On November 8th, during a German counterattack near Wassenach, he pulled the trigger and nothing happened. The firing pin was locked solid, frozen by a mix of congealed lubricant and carbon residue. Harmon wrestled with the bolt, trying to chamber a fresh round. It refused to budge. The bolt lugs were seized. He died clutching a rifle that should have saved him, but wouldn't fire. 3 bullets found him as he struggled. Sullivan carried his friend's body back. Harmon was only 19, from Shreveport, Louisiana. The night before, he had shown Sullivan photos of his little sister. They buried him in a makeshift grave, helmet atop a rifle with bayonet driven into the frozen earth. Standard procedure in a fortress that killed men faster than bullets. The irony was grimly clear to everyone. The rifle functioned perfectly as a grave marker. 2 days later, Corporal Mike Delaney faced the same fate. His M1 fired a single round before jamming so completely that the armorer had to strip it down entirely. The operating rod, the long piston that cycled each shot, was caked in a mixture of LP lubricant, unburned powder, and water, hardened into a mass as thick as cold axle grease. By Army standards, the rifle was clean, but it wouldn't fire. Delaney died in the mud struggling to force life from a weapon that had betrayed him. Sullivan watched from 30 feet away, pinned under relentless machine gun fire. Delaney struggled with the charging handle, trying desperately to force the bolt back. The German shooter was methodical. 3 rounds to the center mass. Delaney collapsed over his broken rifle and never moved again. By November 20th, Sullivan had seen 7 men die from rifles that refused to fire, not all from his own squad. In combat, word traveled fast. A rifle that won't fire is a death sentence. And Private Rodriguez from B Company had learned that lesson the hardest. Sergeant Whitfield of HQ Company was dead. Lieutenant Brennan of C Company survived, but only because his .45 pistol still worked. His M1 had become a rusted, useless paperweight. By late November, rifle malfunctions had claimed 14% of the men. 14 out of every 100 soldiers killed by a weapon meant to save them. The number should have been 0. The M1 Garand was the pinnacle of infantry rifle design. In theory, American riflemen should have dominated the battlefield. In reality, a single flaw had turned their most trusted advantage into a deadly liability. Instead, American soldiers were falling to German troops armed with bolt-action Kar 98Ks, rifles designed in 1898, firing with deadly precision. Sullivan raised the alarm to his platoon. "Sergeant," he said, "these rifles are seizing up. The LP oil is too thick for this cold and wet." Sergeant Kowalski flipped through the manual. "It says LP works in all temperatures," he replied. "Corporal, the manual's wrong," Sullivan countered. "I'm a mechanic. This carbon-heavy lubricant seeps into the gas system, mixes with powder residue and water, and turns to paste. We need lighter oil, or more men will die." "You an ordnance engineer now, Sullivan?" Kowalski asked. "No," Sullivan shot back, "but I know how metal behaves in cold. This stuff is killing us." Kowalski shrugged. "Take it up with the armorer." He did. Sergeant First Class Preston, a career soldier who had been maintaining rifles since the Philippines in '42, listened patiently. He flipped open the technical manual. "LP oil, applied to all moving parts. That's what we use." Sullivan shook his head. "It's not working. The lubricants are within spec." Preston's reply was chilling. "If the rifles are malfunctioning, it's operator error." "Tell your men to clean their rifles better." "They're clean," Sullivan shot back. "The lubricant's wrong for these conditions. Men are dying." Preston's expression hardened. "Are you questioning Army ordnance specifications?" "I'm saying men are dying." Preston's voice was firm. "Son, I've been an armorer for 8 years. These manuals are written by engineers with college degrees. You're a corporal from Montana who fixes cars. I think I'll trust the engineers." Sullivan said nothing. He turned and walked away, the weight of every fallen soldier pressing down on him. That night, Private Hartnell's rifle seized during a patrol. He survived only because the German soldier who spotted him had the same problem. His Kar 98K bolt frozen solid by the mud and cold that was crippling American weapons.
15 feet apart, both men struggled desperately with their rifles until Hartnell's squadmate fired a carbine, killing the German. Pure luck. Sullivan couldn't bear to watch more lives hinge on chance. On December 5, 1944, at 01:30 hours, he sat alone in a battered barn the platoon was using for shelter, the cold seeping into his bones and his mind racing with a solution. Everyone else slept or stood watch. Sullivan worked alone, his M1 completely disassembled on a wooden crate, the only light a shielded candle flickering over the pieces. The rifle lay in fragments: receiver, trigger assembly, operating rod, bolt, gas cylinder, each part coated in LP lubricant exactly as Army regulations demanded. Sullivan wiped each component dry, then went further. With a steel pick, he scraped hardened carbon from the gas cylinder, bolt lugs, and trigger mechanism. The residue was baked solid, fused by hundreds of rounds fired. 40 minutes later, every trace of it was gone. His hands ached from the cold and the endless scraping. Then came the part he had feared, the forbidden step. For 2 weeks, ever since Delaney died, he had thought about it. The problem was clear. LP lubricant was made for temperate climates. Heavy petroleum distillates thickened in the cold, and when mixed with carbon and water, they turned to a paste that seized every moving part. The solution was simple: don't use it. But the manual was explicit: LP lubricant on all moving parts. Following it meant death. Ignoring it meant survival. Failure to lubricate a rifle wasn't a small mistake. It was a court-martial offense. The Army called it destruction of government property. An M1 Garand cost $85, nearly 2 months' pay for a corporal. Run it dry, damage the action, the Army would bill you for the rifle and then prosecute you for negligence. Sullivan stared at the scattered parts on the crate. He pictured Harmon, Delaney, Rodriguez, Whitfield, Brennan, and the others whose names still echoed in his head. Men who died because the rule book mattered more than reality. Men who would die tomorrow if nothing changed. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for another answer. In the dark corner of the barn, he'd spotted a dented jerry can once used for Jeep motor oil. He tipped a small measure into his canteen cup. Motor oil, thin, fast-flowing petroleum-based, built to stay alive in freezing temperatures. Back home in Montana, mechanics trusted it because it never turned to sludge in winter. It wasn't a sanctioned lubricant for weapons. The manual didn't even acknowledge its existence. Using it on an M1 Garand was the technical equivalent of greasing a pocket watch with axle fluid. It wasn't technically banned, only because no one imagined a soldier would be reckless enough to try it. Sullivan dipped a corner of a rag into the motor oil and worked with a surgeon's precision. He brushed the faintest sheen onto the bolt lugs, just enough to stop raw steel from grinding itself apart. Then the op rod rails, the hammer, the trigger sear. Every point where metal kissed metal received nothing more than a whisper of lubrication. The gas cylinder, the birthplace of half the malfunctions he'd seen, demanded even more care. He coated its interior, then wiped almost all of it away, leaving only an invisible film. One drop too much, and the action would choke again. He wasn't fixing a rifle. He was rewriting its entire anatomy in the dark.
Too little oil and the carbon would seize the piston. Too much and the rifle would choke again. Sullivan aimed for the absolute minimum, barely a tenth of what the manual recommended. He reassembled the rifle in 8 precise minutes. The bolt cycled smoothly, cleaner than it had in weeks. The trigger snapped sharply. The safety clicked perfectly into place. In his hands, the rifle felt alive.
He chambered a round, ejected it, then chambered another. He repeated it 20 times, each cycle flawless. The cold barn faded around him. All that mattered was the rifle responding exactly as it should. The rifle ran like a finely tuned machine. Then doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if the motor oil ruined the gas system under sustained fire? What if it fouled faster than LP lubricant? What if the rifle blew apart in his hands during combat? Court-martial was inevitable, maybe 5 years in Leavenworth for destroying government property and endangering soldiers. But the thought that weighed heaviest, if he was right and kept it to himself, others would die with jammed rifles while his worked flawlessly. That, he realized, would be a far worse crime: moral cowardice. Sullivan sat alone in the barn, rifle resting across his knees, carrying the weight of 2 kinds of guilt. Outside, rain began to tap against the battered roof. He could hear each drop, smell the wet pine, and feel the cold seeping through his wool uniform. He made his choice. He would tell no one. December 7th, 8:15 a.m. Sullivan's squad moved through the German lines. They had spent the night in forward positions, rotating watch, huddled in foxholes that filled with icy water, trying desperately to stay warm while the forest around them whispered of danger. No matter how many pine branches lined their foxholes, the rain had turned to sleet around 0300 and back to rain by dawn. Sullivan's rifle had sat exposed to moisture for 11 relentless hours. Then the attack hit without warning. 9 German soldiers, dressed in winter camouflage, moved through the trees with deadly coordination. Sullivan's squad numbered 5. 1 man was already wounded, unable to fight, leaving 4 against 9. Private Jennings fired first. His M1 discharged a single round and then jammed. Sullivan heard Jennings cursing, the harsh click, click, click of a soldier wrestling a frozen bolt. Private Garcia fired next, 3 shots, then jam. The bolt locked on a round that refused to chamber, the brass case stuck halfway in the receiver. The Germans advanced methodically. Their Kar 98K bolt-action rifles were slower but reliable in the cold. 1 German, 2 Germans, 3. They moved with textbook precision, bounding between trees while others laid down covering fire. Sullivan lifted his M1 to his shoulder. He took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared to life. Sullivan shifted his aim and fired again. The German soldier on the left dropped. The action cycled flawlessly. Bolt back, spent round ejected, fresh round chambered, bolt forward, all in a fraction of a second. This was what the M1 Garand was built for. Sullivan felt the difference instantly. No hesitation, no grinding, no resistance, only smooth mechanical precision. He fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession. 2 more Germans fell. The rest scrambled for cover. Meanwhile, his squad mates continued struggling, their M1s jammed and useless against the advancing enemy. Jennings had cleared his jam long enough to fire 2 rounds before his M1 locked up again. Garcia had given up on his rifle, drawing a knife for close combat. The Germans tried to flank, 4 to the left, 2 to the right, 3 providing covering fire from behind thick pines. Standard Wehrmacht infantry tactics. They assumed they faced a broken squad hampered by malfunctioning rifles. Easy prey. Sullivan tracked the left flank carefully. The enemy moved in bounds, precise and methodical, unaware that 1 rifle in his hands had regained its deadly efficiency. 1 German advanced while 3 provided covering fire, then they switched positions. They closed, 60 yards, 50, 40. Sullivan waited until they reached 30 yards. Then he unleashed his M1. In semi-automatic, it fired as fast as he could pull the trigger. Practical rate, 40 rounds per minute for a seasoned rifleman. 8 rounds in 10 seconds. The sharp ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting rang through the forest. 2 seconds later, another clip of 8 rounds was chambered. The left flank halted. 2 Germans lay motionless. 1 crawled behind a tree, leaving a streak of blood in the sleet-soaked ground. The 4th soldier dropped to the ground completely. The Germans on the right flank faltered, and that hesitation proved fatal. Sullivan shifted his aim and fired 4 rounds into their position. One stumbled backward, shoulder hit. Another never moved again. 15 seconds of relentless fire. 15 rounds gone. 5 Germans down, 1 wounded, and 3 pinned. The 3 men providing covering fire broke and ran. Sullivan tracked them through the dense pines, moving targets at 70 yards, hidden by branches and sleet. He led the first runner, squeezed the trigger, missed. Adjusted. Fired again. The German dropped. He swung on the second runner, firing twice. 1 hit. The German kept moving, but his gait faltered, a leg wound. Not fatal. The third man made it to cover. His rifle was empty. He chambered his last clip. 8 rounds remaining. The fight was over. 5 Germans dead, 1 wounded and crawling, 3 retreating. In just 40 seconds, Sullivan's M1 had fired 23 rounds without a single malfunction. Every other Garand in his squad had jammed within the first 5 shots. This rifle, finally, was living up to its reputation. Private Jennings stared at Sullivan's rifle as if it were a sacred relic. "How is your weapon still working?" Sullivan looked down at the M1 in his hands. Smoke curled from the barrel. The wood stock was slick with rain. The action was splattered with mud from muzzle blasts hitting the wet ground. It should have jammed 10 rounds ago. "I don't know," Sullivan lied.
They held position for another hour, waiting for German reinforcements that never came. Sullivan kept the rifle ready, but the forest stayed quiet except for the steady rain. When the squad finally returned to company lines, Sergeant Kowalski was waiting at the CP. Sullivan had just returned from contact, and Kowalski wasted no time. 9 Germans had advanced, Sullivan reported, but they retreated after the fight, with 5 confirmed killed. Most of his squad's rifles had jammed. Jennings and Garcia couldn't fire. Rodriguez was already wounded. It had fallen mostly to him. Kowalski's gaze shifted to Sullivan's rifle. "Your M1 worked the whole fight?" he asked. Sullivan nodded. 23 rounds fired, perfectly. Kowalski lifted the weapon, worked the bolt, which moved smoothly, then peered into the receiver, inspecting the mechanism, letting the significance of the morning's battle sink in. The rifle was filthy. Carbon buildup, powder residue, mud spatter from sustained fire, but the action moved freely. Kowalski's eyes steadied it carefully. "You did something different with maintenance?" he asked. Sullivan met his gaze. "Just cleaned it good, Sergeant." Kowalski held the stare, processing the weight of the situation. If Sullivan had altered the rifle against regulations, it could mean court-martial. But if his M1 was the only one functioning while every other rifle jammed in the forest, perhaps the regulations were failing. "Show me," Kowalski said finally. "Tonight, after chow, show me exactly what you did." Rumors move quicker than bullets on the front line. By sunset, riflemen from half a dozen squads drifted toward Sullivan's dugout, each one wanting to see the weapon that hadn't failed in the storm. By dawn, Sullivan had repeated the same process 14 times. Field strip every piece, scrape every trace of carbon, clean until metal shone, then coat it with the lightest film of engine oil instead of regulation lube. "Engine oil? From where?" Hernandez whispered. "The motor pool keeps jerry cans for the Jeeps, 10 weight. That's what you need." Hernandez frowned. "The armorer will kill us." Sullivan shook his head. "The armorer doesn't have to know. Decide, do you want a rifle that fires or a rulebook that doesn't?" Hernandez hesitated only a moment before gripping the can of oil. Soon Davidson was doing it, then Meyer, then PFC Wong, Sergeant Lewis, and nearly a dozen more whose names Sullivan never caught in the blackout hours. They huddled over their rifles by candle stubs in barns, cellars, and flooded foxholes, stripping every mechanism to bare metal, scraping out weeks of carbon, and brushing on the outlawed oil no manual dared mention. No forms, no signatures, no permission. Just men refusing to die because of a clogged gas cylinder. On December 9th, B Company walked straight into a firefight near Gross. 15 riflemen carried M1s tuned with engine oil. Every one of those rifles ran flawlessly. The rest of B Company's rifles, still coated in standard LP lubricant, jammed at the predictable rate. The difference was so stark that the company commander took notice. That evening, Captain Harrison summoned Sullivan to headquarters. "Corporal Sullivan, I'm told you've been altering rifles, teaching improved cleaning methods, using unauthorized oils," Harrison said. Sullivan said nothing. Harrison leaned back in his chair, a man of 31 from Philadelphia, a lawyer before the war. 7 months commanding B Company, 43 letters sent home to grieving families, 14 of those deaths traced back to weapons that failed when they were needed most. "The manual specifies LP lubricant," Harrison said, his tone measured but sharp. "Using engine oil violates every maintenance protocol. That's destruction of government property, a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir," Sullivan replied quietly. "How many men have you taught this to?" "I don't know, sir." "Word spreads fast in the field. Your rifle fired 23 rounds without a single malfunction under conditions where every other M1 jammed within 5. That's documented. And yesterday, 15 rifles in my company ran flawlessly while the rest failed at the usual rate. Every one of those 15 belongs to soldiers you instructed, also documented." Sullivan stood silently as Captain Harrison weighed his words. "By the book, I should court-martial you. That's what the regulations demand." He paused, jaw tightening. "But those same regulations also claim LP lubricant functions in all conditions, and the battlefield is proving that to be a lie." He exhaled slowly. "So I'm left with a decision. Punish a man for breaking a rule that's getting soldiers killed, or look the other way and let you keep saving lives." Harrison rose and moved to the rain-streaked window. "Keep teaching," he said quietly. "Every man in B Company. But if division comes asking, I never approved any of this. Understood?" Sullivan agreed. Dismissed. By December 12th, Sullivan had personally trained 47 riflemen. Within 3 days, the word had spread to 3 other companies in the regiment. By December 18th, armorers discovered traces of motor oil in rifles during inspections, and quietly looked the other way. The improvised modifications swept through the trenches like wildfire, soldier to soldier, squad to squad, company to company, battalion to battalion. By December 20th, division headquarters had taken notice. Colonel Patterson, the division's ordnance officer, immediately ordered a full investigation. Colonel Patterson needed answers. Why was motor oil vanishing from supply faster than expected? Why were rifles coming through maintenance coated in unauthorized lubricant? Who was responsible? The investigation ran in circles. Every soldier in question insisted they had learned the technique from another, passing it along like a whispered secret. No one could pinpoint the original source. Paper trails twisted back on themselves. Sergeants feigned ignorance. Company commanders feigned surprise. Every lead dissolved into silence, leaving Patterson with nothing but a forest full of rifles that now functioned when they should have failed.
Battalion staff officers argued it was simply an organic adaptation by frontline troops. Patterson knew he couldn't court-martial an entire division. On December 27th, he took the only sensible step. He contacted the ordnance engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, requesting a formal evaluation of motor oil as an alternative lubricant for M1 Garands under extreme cold weather conditions. The engineers met the suggestion with skepticism. LP lubricant had undergone extensive testing and was officially approved for all temperatures. Yet the field was telling a different story, and Patterson intended to find out why. Motor oil had been engineered for engines, not finely tuned firearms. Employing automotive lubricants in weapon systems directly contradicted established ordnance principles. Yet the engineers agreed to conduct the tests. 3 weeks later, the results arrived. 10-weight motor oil consistently outperformed standard LP lubricant in conditions between 28 and 35 degrees F, especially when moisture levels were high. Its lighter viscosity prevented the formation of carbon paste inside the gas cylinder, and the minimal application significantly reduced fouling, allowing rifles to function reliably where regulation lubricant had failed. The rifles functioned flawlessly, perhaps even better than before. The report recommended formal field trials, but in reality they weren't needed. By January 1945, roughly 40% of M1 Garands in the European theater were being maintained with motor oil instead of LP lubricant. The practice had spread to units that had never set foot in Herkenforest. News traveled fast, through replacement soldiers, rear echelon mechanics, and even letters home, detailing the trick to keeping rifles operational. The numbers told the story. Soldiers had discovered a life-saving method, and the results could no longer be ignored. In November 1944, before the motor oil adaptation, the 28th Infantry Division reported rifle malfunctions in 14% of combat engagements. By January 1945, after the practice had spread, that rate plummeted to just 3%, a staggering 78% reduction. Conservative estimates attribute the modification to preventing more than 1,200 weapon-related casualties in the First Army alone between December 1944 and March 1945. The German perspective was harder to quantify, but intercepted radio transmissions from January 1945 offered a glimpse. Opposing forces noticed the sudden, deadly efficiency of American riflemen in the field. German intelligence quickly took notice. Reports highlighted a dramatic improvement in the reliability of American rifles. Soldiers who had long counted on weapon malfunctions to gain the upper hand in winter combat suddenly found that advantage disappearing. One intercepted report from a Wehrmacht battalion commander in the Ardennes read, "American infantry weapons now operate as reliably as our own, erasing our tactical edge in prolonged winter engagements." By March 1945, the same motor oil modification had spread even to U.S. forces fighting in the Pacific, proving its effectiveness across theaters and climates alike. American riflemen in Okinawa, confronting the same high-moisture, punishing conditions, had already begun using motor oil to maintain their weapons. Japanese intelligence reports from the island noted American rifles performing with unusual reliability, despite weather that should have given bolt-action rifles the advantage. The modification had spread across the globe, yet it had never been officially sanctioned. By the war's end in August 1945, Army Ordnance was still debating whether to formally approve motor oil as a standard lubricant for the M1 Garand. Engineering committees convened, but the field had already written the final verdict. Reports were filed, recommendations drafted, and the debate stretched well into 1946. In reality, it no longer mattered. Soldiers had already made their choice in the field. Red Sullivan never received formal recognition for his innovation. His official service record makes no mention of the life-saving modification. The Distinguished Service Cross he was awarded cited his actions on December 7, 1944. Extraordinary heroism against enemy forces. The citation highlighted the number of enemy soldiers he neutralized, not the rifle maintenance breakthrough that had saved countless American lives. His promotion to sergeant followed in January 1945, a quiet nod to valor rather than ingenuity. Sullivan's career followed a standard path. No special commendation, no award for technical innovation. Most of the soldiers who benefited from his technique never knew his name. He survived the war, remaining in Germany as part of the occupation forces until its conclusion. In November 1945, he boarded a train in New York bound for Montana, carrying little more than a duffel bag. The Army offered him a position as an instructor at Fort Benning, teaching rifle maintenance to new recruits. He politely declined. "I've done my part," he told the officer, leaving behind a legacy few would ever formally acknowledge. Someone else's turn, he thought. Stepping back into civilian life. His sister still lived in the old company house on Mercury Street. Same 3 rooms, same paper-thin walls. For 2 months, Red slept on the couch while searching for work. The copper mines were hiring, his father's old mine, the same 3,000-foot descent he had vowed never to make. Instead, he returned to what he knew best, mechanics. At Anderson's garage on East Park Street, he repaired cars and trucks for miners and railroad workers. The mornings were cold, engines frozen, and drivers often arrived with wrecked transmissions from using the wrong oil. Red repaired every vehicle without judgment, quietly applying the same care he had shown on the battlefield. In 1947, he married Dorothy Wagner, a teacher at Lincoln Elementary, and by 1952, they had 3 children. The family settled into a modest house on Utah Avenue, just a short walk from the garage where Red worked. He rarely spoke of the war. Once a year, on December 7th, he would receive a call, sometimes from Jennings, sometimes Garcia, or Sergeant Kowalski. They spoke about the weather, their families, work, anything really, except that morning in Herkin Forest that had defined them all.
They never needed to speak of it. They had lived it, and that was enough. Red passed away in 1987 at age 65, succumbing to a heart attack while working beneath a car at Anderson's garage. His obituary in the Montana Standard was brief, 3 paragraphs long. Only a single sentence mentioned his military service. Sullivan served in the U.S. Army during World War II, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for valor in the European theater. There was no mention of rifles, no reference to motor oil, no acknowledgement of his quiet innovation. His widow later donated his footlocker to the Montana Historical Society, a small piece of history preserved in silence. Among the items in his footlocker were his discharge papers, the Distinguished Service Cross citation, photographs from Germany, a well-worn copy of FM 235, the M1 Garand field manual, and a small, tattered notebook filled with handwritten maintenance notes. Inside, Sullivan had sketched diagrams showing the precise lubrication points for the M1 Garand, using lightweight 10W automotive motor oil instead of standard military lubricants. In 2003, a historian uncovered the notebook while researching World War II weapons maintenance, cross-referencing it with Army Ordnance reports from 1945, revealing a hidden story of battlefield innovation that had remained unknown for decades. Her research traced the motor oil modification all the way back to December 1944 in the Herkin Forest. Further investigation identified Red Sullivan through surviving members of the 28th Infantry Division. By that time, nearly everyone who could confirm the story had passed away, except for Garcia, who vividly remembered Sullivan's rifle functioning flawlessly while all others jammed. In 1946, the technique was quietly adopted into revised field manuals, becoming standard practice for M1 Garand maintenance, though Sullivan received no credit and his contribution remained largely unknown to the public. By the time of the Korean War, the motor oil method for M1 Garand maintenance was taught in basic training. By Vietnam, it had become common knowledge among armorers. Today, military rifles use advanced synthetic lubricants to prevent the problems LP oil once caused, but the principle remains the same. Minimal lubrication, adapted for cold weather, and function prioritized over strict adherence to regulations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers employed the technique, most never knowing its origin. True innovation in war rarely comes from safe laboratories or field manuals. It comes from a corporal in Montana who saw his comrades die with jammed rifles and refused to let regulations cost another life. Knowledge spread quietly, soldier to soldier, in the shadows between firefights, tips that might save a life tomorrow. Official records credit multiple units with field modifications that improved rifle reliability in the European theater during 1944 to 1945. That is technically true, but the story has a single origin. One man discovered the solution. One man took the risk. One man broke the rules because following them meant watching comrades die. The rest simply had the sense and courage to pay attention.